Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, and in this video we're going to look at a classic race car. And no, it is not going to be an MGB GT. The car we're going to talk about is a Hawke DL19, and that's the one I'm sitting in. This is a car that used to participate in Formula Ford races, the 1.6 liters, considered an entrance level. Hawke was a sports car or race car producer, and they started their business somewhere in 1967, and I believe it was halfway the summer that they had the first car on the track, and they stopped working on the cars somewhere in the 1980s. So for a long time they used to build race cars, and most of the stuff they did build themselves. They did use Ford Kent engines, but more on that later, because we will take this car to some extent apart. We look at all the different things. We will look at the suspension, the steering, we look at the engine, the gearbox, the shell, the chassis, or the frame, and so on. So without any further ado, let me give you a total view on this car. And here's the DL19 painted in red and white. You can't miss the DL19 because it has a very, very sharp nose, as you can see. It also makes it very vulnerable because if you hit something, that nose will just scatter. The shell on this classic race car is made out of polyester, and there's a couple of good reasons why they made the shell out of polyester. Now, one of the main reasons is that you need very quick access to all the different parts, especially the engine, during a race and in between the pit stops. And quick access is really critical in a race, because if something is wrong with the car, you have to be able to get to all the different areas, as well in the back, as in the front, as in the cockpit. And it's not only accessibility. The weight of the shell is very important, because weight is everything in a race. The lighter the car, the better the car will perform. Another important factor is, of course, aerodynamics. And the idea is to have a shape of the body that allows the air to stream gently over it. So not creating a lot of turbulence, but just a very smooth flow. Because the smoother the flow is, the less air resistance you have, the more power you have, the faster you can go. But there's a drawback, of course, because the cars are very light, they can actually lift up easily. Now, normally you would see kind of spoilers, or you would see wings, or you see curtains on cars, on modern cars. In those days, in the Formula Ford 1600, that was not allowed. These curtains, or these spoilers, or these wings, they're actually pushing down the car as low as possible and as hard as possible to the ground. So that creates stability. But these cars didn't have that. But they were very low to the ground, and I'll show you that in a minute. You almost sit on the ground. And on the DL19 you have on the side ducting, and it's an air intake, so while you drive, air comes in here and it goes through the ducting and it streams all the way to the back, where we have a radiator or an oil cooler. And I'll show you that in a few seconds. And everything is fitted with quick release locks. Alright, so let's take this off, and don't laugh, guys, because I'm on my socks. The reason for that is that my shoes are making way too much noise on this floor. It squeaks. Those ducts or air ducts actually guide the air towards the oil cooler, and on the left hand side we have an oil cooler, on the other side we have a radiator. With these locks, the polyester tends to crack every so often, so I will have to put some new ones in, but I also will put a new aluminum support around it. Alright, so that should be loose. And in the back you can actually see the radiator. And now we have a pretty good view on the frame of the car, and we can start looking at all the different components. And the frame that you see right now is what we call a space frame, and it's very, very rigid and strong. Now remember, I mentioned to you that this was a DL19 and serial number 34, and here's that identity plate inside the cockpit. Now normally I think it used to be more on the back on the chassis, so probably somebody moved it more to the front. If it's genuine, I cannot tell, but I think it is. So let's check how high this is from the ground, and this is about 5.5 to 6 centimeters. So that is pretty low. I think according to the specs that I found, this is a little bit too low. but that might be because of the shocks they've put up. And there's a very good reason why it's so low to the ground, because in racing you want to have your point of gravity as low as possible. Now let's have a look on the steering. And the steering wheel, well, of course that is removable, otherwise you can't get in and out of this car. It has known better days, but we'll change that. We put a new one up, not that expensive. Now the steering is very direct, and that's also very important. So you actually can feel the grip on the road because of the steering being so direct. Here we have the steering house. So the shaft is coming from the steering wheel right here. I don't know what kind of a steering house is installed. Is it an Ackerman or not? And if it's an Ackerman, is it a pro or an anti-Ackerman arrangement? But for that we need to do a couple of measurements, and maybe I need to explain you what an Ackerman is, just in case you don't know. Road cars have typical symmetric steering, and that means whenever you take a corner, both wheels are going to turn in the same direction as I show right here. The distance between this point here and that point is the same as the distance between this point and that point. So in other words, the wheels are both in the same direction. Obviously, when you take a corner, you will have an inner radius and you have an outer radius. So with symmetric steering, you can't have the inner wheel following the inner radius, and you can't have the outer wheel following the outer radius. It's somewhere a balance in between. And that is okay for standard road cars. However, in racing, that is less optimum, because you're going through these corners on a high speed and you really want to corner properly. That is why people apply a method called Ackerman. An Ackerman comes in two types: Pro Ackerman and anti-Ackerman. The idea of Pro Ackerman is that whenever you're going to hit a corner, we will have the inner wheel scribing that inner radius, and the outer wheel will scribe the outer radius. So see, I have modified the wheel a bit, so now the distance between this point and that point is closer, and the front points are now wider. So this is what we call Pro Ackerman. So the outer wheel will now follow the outer radius, and the inner wheel will follow the inner radius. That works fine. However, we need to think about something else. Whenever we are cornering at high speed, a lot of the weight of the car is transferred to the outer wheels. And that's the wheel that has all the grip. The inner wheel doesn't have that much grip. Sometimes it even lifts up a bit. So what we want is that we want to steer extra into that corner, and this is what we call anti-Ackerman. And therefore we're going to place that inner outer wheel extremely inward. So let me just show you that. So see how we extremely turn that in. And that will force that car really into that corner, and it will hold it in that whole corner properly because of all the weight being transferred to it. Now there's a limitation, of course, on how much anti-Ackerman degrees you can give to the front steering, because this is going to start wearing out the tire real quick because it's going to scrub. Now there's other parameters that we need to consider, like the slip tread of the tires and the tire deformation. I'm not going to talk about this one right now because that is probably a complete different video about tires, but I hope at least I could explain you what Ackerman is, anti-Ackerman, Pro Ackerman, and symmetric steering. I have no idea what the steering house is on this car, so I'm going to turn the wheels into one direction, and then I will measure the distance in the back and in the front, and then if that distance is the same, then certainly we have no Ackerman. And I should try to do it at the same level. So this is 124, and I know I should do it on the rims, but I'm a bit lazy for the moment. So, but this is also 124. So in essence, the steering house is a symmetric steering house. There is no Ackerman on it whatsoever. So now let's look at the suspension. In the back we got adjustable shocks with a certain rate of springs. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but on the bottom we got the 2 rings, and with that one we can set the preload. I'm not going to do this one right now. This is something we'll do later to check the preload, because that's important, so we'll balance out the car. And in the front, we got the shocks inside. So this is good for aerodynamics. In the back, they're hidden because of the radiators. But here, they sit nicely inside, and they are even adjustable. So that's the softness of the dampening that you can adjust. And like with all race cars, we have a lower wishbone and we have an upper wishbone. And then in the middle, we've got our upright. And the upright from Hawke is homemade. So they did not decide to have molded uprights because they tend to crack. The ones that they built with steel, they won't crack. They may deform, but they're not going to crack. So it's a bit safer. In the front, we got an anti-roll bar with a couple of positions, and that is very important for cornering, probably even more than anything else, that you have the right torsion bar installed and the right adjustment. And of course, like any other race car, we have adjustments for the toe-in. So the front wheels, do they point inwards or do they point outwards? This race car should have a toe-in of about 1 degree. The caster is something that we will measure eventually, but not right now, because that is depending on how much the uprights are moving forward or backwards, but typically they never move backward, they always move a bit forward, so that's the caster. And then we have the camber, which is the horizontal position of the wheel. So I think this race car has negative camber, or should have negative camber, of about 1 to 2 degrees, and this is something I'll show you on how you can measure that. All the other stuff for the final adjustments, I'll make a special video on that one, on how we go into do a shakedown on this car, on how we're going to align it, how we're going to do the preload and all this. But let me show you now the camber on this car, on how you can actually check that. Now to measure the camber, this is the tool I'm using, and it's very handy. So you need to align it first with a level. So you hold it horizontally like this, and then you make sure that the level is on this side here, and then you adjust it so it's calibrated. And then all you need to do is stick it to the disc of the wheels, and then you'll see how much camber you have. So let me put the camber meter on the disc, and of course you got to make sure that the disc is not crooked or anything. Normally you would do it on the wheel hub itself, and it's about 1 degree of camber negative, so that is all right, I think. So let's see what happens if we turn the steering wheel, because that should now change. You can see how that is moving up to 2 degrees. In fact, even 3 degrees, and that is normal, because that is because of the caster that we have actually on the upright. I'm having a level on top of the tire, and as you can see, the inner side of the tire, which is this side there, is far more worn than the outer side, and that is just because of the negative camber that we just measured. So if you have too much negative camber, you're really going to wear out the tires on the inner side if it's negative camber. If it's positive camber, you're going to start wearing out the tires on the outer side. Adjusting the toe is done on the steering rods, one on the left and one on the right, by adjusting these bolts here and these nuts. You got to be careful that you do it on both sides about equal, because otherwise it may fall out, or you may have just a little bit of tread left, and that would not be a good idea. So on this car we use toe-in, so the front of the wheel is pointing inwards towards the center of the car, and it's about 1.5 millimeters, I think, of toe-in you need on this as a good common number. Typically you do that on special scales, and we'll do that later once we get this car ready for the track. In terms of instrumentation, there is not a lot to be said about it, because it's very minimal. So let me take the steering wheel off so we have a better sight. To be very honest, the only things you worry about once you're racing is your RPM meter. That's this one. For this car, I think 5,500 is a good speed to maintain and to shift, and I'll talk about that shifting later. And about 6,500 is about the max on this engine, so I probably will put a red marker up there. The other thing you want to keep an eye on is the temperature of the water. This is over here, so that should be between 90 and 100. They should not go higher than that. And of course, the oil pressure is kind of a critical element. Now, on this car, I don't know how much I have, but let's see if I can crank it up, and we'll check how much we have. I want to make sure it's not in gear, because that would not be good, would it? All right, so let's see if we can get it cranked up. And on this car, to start it, we have actually a electrical fuel pump to kick it in. And you probably can hear it, that it's pumping now. And then once it's running, we go over to the normal mechanical fuel pumps. Let's see if we can get it ignition on and get it started. Well, I think I have a flat battery, so that's not very good. I think I need to get another battery first, guys, before I can show you that. So in front of the car we have a small battery, and that is intended to power the ignition, to power some of the instruments and the rain light during the actual race. Because the car does not have an alternator, because we don't want to lose power. We want to use all the power for the traction on the wheels and not to charge the battery. So that is why you can't really start with this battery. Well, maybe you can start once or twice as an emergency, but that's about it. Especially if the engine stalls somewhere along the track, then you can try it. That is why you need an extra battery to start up the car. This is a 8 battery to start the car. It has a connector with it that connects to the car, and that's what we use to initially start it up. And that's where the plug is. Let's turn on the fuel pump, the electrical fuel pump. We can turn on the ignition, and then we should be able to start it. You can see we got a lot of oil pressure, around 4 bar, which is quite good. The seat is a polyester shell, and I'll take it out in a few minutes. We also got the seat belts, but they are expired by quite some time. So there's a FIA approval, but look on the date until 2004, something like that. So they will have to be replaced, because this is a lot about your own safety. So let's put this on the side. And this is a 4 connection belt system with leg straps, as you can see. All right, so let's see if I can take the shell out. And the gas tank is just below the seat. I don't think this is a fuel cell. This is a old polyester gas tank. This is something I don't really like, but okay, it is what it is. And filling that up is not easy if the seat is in, because you can't get to this. So this is something I will need to replace or fix. So I'm probably going to go and have an extension here on the side to fill it up. But in fact, my seat has to come more forward because I'm too short. And just below your legs, we got the fire extinguisher, and your legs are coming through this opening here. So it's all very narrow, and the fire extinguisher is a pretty big bottle here, but I'm quite sure it is also expired. There is a pull handle on the dashboard to engage the fire extinguisher, which is going down with a cable to activate it. Here you have that cable going to the handle of the fire extinguisher, and I can see that the pressure is still in the green, so this is good. So normally that should still work. And this system is having a tube which is going all the way to the back to some nozzles. So that tube from the fire extinguisher is actually spraying right here on these nozzles on the exhaust manifold. I don't know if this is the right place, and it's a little bit loose, so this is something we probably will fix as well to make it a little bit more tight. Now I'm a pretty short guy, so these pedals are too far down for me. I can't barely reach. So we got a clutch, we got the brake, and we have two brake cylinders, master brake cylinders, one for the front, one for the rear. And there's some adjustments on the bottom that you can do for the brake balance. It's not with a knob like on the other race car, but that's okay. On the other side of the brake pedal, we've got two master brake cylinders, one for the front brakes and one for the rear brakes. So I will have to move this a bit forward, and there's an option and more holes there to bring it about, let's say 8 centimeters to 10 centimeters forward. And I also bring the seat a little bit forward, and then I should be in a pretty good condition to sit, because you want to be comfortable. So this is the rod which is coming from the steering house to the steering wheel. And here we also have an adjustment, so I can move the steering wheel more forward or backward, and I will have to move it more forward, more towards the back of the car, because I'm too short. The engine that is fitted in this race car is the traditional Ford Kent motor, and this one is prepared. It has about 140 horsepower. It's a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder. The cylinder head on this car has been modified. It's actually stage 3 cylinder head, modified by Burton. And it is what we call a cross-flow head. In other words, the intake ports coming from the carburetor are exactly across the exhaust ports for the exhaust. And that's what we call a cross-flow head. The muffler and the pipes are in stainless steel, so this is something which probably will last a long time. And they did a real good job on these pipes. They are nicely bent, and I think lengths are about the same. That's why they made a couple of curves in there to make them about the same length. The welds are really nice. I haven't seen very often such a nice welding on stainless steel, so that is pretty good. I cannot complain about that. Carburetor is a Weber D-Gas 3436. Now, you could have Webers on it, DCOEs. Maybe 2 of them. That would give you a bit more horsepower, but this carburetor is not too bad either, so I don't really worry too much about it. There is an air filter that is most likely easily removable. So here we go. So that can go off, very simple. And inside you can actually see the main Venturis, and that's the 34. As this is a 76 car, we've got the traditional ignition coil on it. Also a traditional distributor, but the race distributor, and we have the electronic ignition here, from Luminition, which is a good brand. I don't know if it existed in 76, but in its case it's on this car, so I assume it's allowed under the regulations for classic racing. And the distributor is over here, and I'm quite sure that we have electronic points inside, so let's see. And as I suspected, we do. This is the rotor, and below that you see these little wings here. This is what is pulsing that LED here. So each time that passes, you create a pulse. It's the same mechanism as what you normally would see on normal breaker points. But that's not the only thing that has been modified on that engine. It has a light flywheel. It has no alternator, as we talked before. But the main difference is that it does not have a normal oil pan. This is a dry sump engine, and that's specifically for racing. So let me explain you that on the board, what a dry sump is, and then we'll have a look. Right, so what I have here on the board is a very simple engine. And this is a traditional engine with a traditional oil sump. And here is the sump on the bottom. And I'm sure you've seen all this, and typically you have right here a little plug to let the oil out. And the oil is actually sitting in the sump like this. Right? So when the engine is not running, all the oil has been dripping down from all the different areas into the sump. As soon as you start up the engine, the oil pump starts to spin, and it's going to suck out oil through this little filter on the bottom of the oil pump, and then it pushes it out through all the channels throughout the whole engine, through the camshaft to the crankshaft to the valves, all that, and then it leaks back into the sump. So basically this is kind of a closed circuit, you could say. The only problem with that is that whenever you take a very strong curve at high speed, due to the centrifugal forces, you'll see that the oil may move to one side. So it might be sitting all here. So now for a very short moment in time, the oil pump is now sucking air. And that's not good because now you have a drop in the oil pressure and you're going to have more wear and tear on the engine. So that is why on race engines you can't really use this. Now some people still use a oil sump underneath the engine and they put some baffles in, so dividers. So the oil is a bit captured, it can't move that much, and in between the baffles there are little holes. So that is one method that does work, but it's not really something you should do on a race car. That is why race cars are having actually a dry sump. And let me draw that for you, how a dry sump looks like. So I'm going to wipe this out and we're going to redraw it. On the board we now have a basic diagram of a dry sump engine. On the bottom we have what we call a collector. External to the engine we have a collection oil pump and we have a pressure oil pump, and then we have an external oil reservoir. So the oil is actually all collected in the reservoir. It gets sucked up by the oil pump when the engine is running, and this is the high pressure, the 4 bar that you have seen, and it actually oils the complete engine. And like any other engine, oil is then leaving the engine and is dripping back at where normally you would find the oil sump. But now we have a very thin collector, we call it, and the oil collects in there, it comes together, but then this pump here will then drain that collector all the time and pushes that oil back into the oil reservoir. In fact, I should have shown that a little bit higher up. This is how it works. So draining this system is a bit of an issue because you really have no drain plug. So I typically suck it out through the filling hole here with a vacuum tube. That works great. Now, in this case, the oil is completely outside the engine, and you have no issue if you corner or you go in uphill or downhill, because there's always a lot of oil in this oil reservoir, which you otherwise wouldn't have in the the normal sump. So this oil reservoir has also divisions inside and baffles inside, so that you always have a proper amount of oil inside. This is what race engines always have, and this is the best solution. Of course, there are more elements to it, like an oil cooler and oil filters. I haven't shown you that, but I just wanted to show you the difference between a dry sump and a normal wet sump that you find on traditional cars. So race cars really should have a dry sump. And this might be a little bit hard to see, but the oil pump is sitting right here on the external side. And you can see all these big hoses coming out of that. This hose right here is actually the high pressure side, so the part that goes back to the engine. But first of all, it goes through the filter. So the oil is leaving the high pressure oil pump, and then it gets into the filter right here. And then it gets back on the other side, it gets back into the channels of the engine. The oil tank is right here. This is where it is. So this is a big aluminum tank where all the oil is sitting in. Now there's no dipstick on this car because a dipstick typically works on your wet sump. So there's no dipstick. I typically use a stick and I put the stick inside and I'm looking for 18 centimeters of oil, and that should be good enough. So this is how I do it. Now, since this is a race car and it's going on a track, you're not allowed to spill oil or liquid onto the track because that could endanger the other drivers and yourself. And therefore, every race car has to have spillover tanks. Let me show you that one. And this is going to be a little bit of a joke on this car. Any possible spill of oil or any liquid on your race car has to be collected in a spill box. Now, this is kind of a funny one. This looks like a bicycle racing thingy. So I'm probably going to change that a bit because this is so funny. Now the hose that you see coming in here is a spillover from the actual oil tank, and this one is the spillover from the gearbox, and we'll talk about the gearbox in a few minutes. So this thing I will probably change because this is kind of a funny thing. So it looks like a holder from a bicycle, but it works, I guess. So yeah, but we'll change that with a proper box. We have talked a lot about the suspension already. By the way, this bar here is the rear anti-roll bar. This is a solid bar and again adjustable. But now we need to talk a bit about the gear system or the gearbox. The clutch is over there and it's a hydraulic clutch. Not that you really need it on this car. Well, for first gear you do need it because this gearbox is what we call a dog box. And I'll come back to that in a minute what that is. Of course, you have your shafts going to your wheels. You have one on the left and on the right. And over here, you have your Hewland box, and I think this is an MK9. And that's where all the gears are in. And this is what we call a dog box. In fact, this part here is your differential, right? So what is a dog box? Oh, that feels comfortable. So let's talk a bit about the gearbox, the standard gearbox, and then we talk about the dog gearbox that you find in race cars, like on this one. Now, a normal street car has a gearbox. You have 4 gears, 5 gears, 6 gears, whatever, and you have a clutch. So you go into change gears, you depress the clutch, you let the clutch come at the right time, you change the gear and all this, and that takes a little bit of time. This is slow in race terms. We can't afford that slowness. The shifting goes very smooth, it doesn't crack, at least if you do it right. And that is because you have synchro meshes inside. Right? And that prevents that these tooth wheels, or the gears, are crunching over each other. So you can actually shift gears up and down very smooth. Right? So you're driving actually quite relaxed. In a race car, that is a bit of a different story. There you are driving violently. I'm going to call it like this because this is actually what you do. You shift real quick because that's important. Shifting fast is so important. You keep your RPMs at around, in this car, 5,000 RPMs, and you try to stay around that, and you shift real quick and really quick. And I can't show you that because I'm not on the track, but next time we are on a track, I will actually show you that to you. And now we need another type of gearbox because a synchro mesh gearbox is way too slow. That is why a dog gearbox has been developed. And it's a very simple gearbox, very, very simple. It is one main shaft, and I'm not going to call the technical terms of the shaft, delay shafts and so on, but one main shaft where you find tooth wheels on. And they are fixed on that shaft, so they can't really rotate around the shaft, but they are connected to the shaft. And that shaft is driven by the back of your clutch system, so by the engine. And then you have your gear selector, and you can select gears on the second shaft, where these gears are spinning freely on. And you engage the right gear, first, second, third, or fourth, or fifth, whatever, how many gears you have, through what we call a dog ring. And this is a dog ring. The reason they call it a dog ring is because of the shape it is, and you could see like little ears. People call them ears. I don't know. You have to have a lot of imagination, but that's where the name is coming from. And that is what is used, and this is going to grab into the gears, and I'm going to show you that in a few minutes. Now that's one thing. So now you know more or less what a dog box is. So you mainly have 2 main axles, one with fixed tooth wheels on or gears on. It's fixed, it's been driven by the engine, and the second one is with selective gears that you can push in or out, and the gears are being pushed in by the selector, and the selector is pushing the dog rings in to engage these gears. And I'll show you that in a few seconds. Now there's another element that is so important on racing. Not all racetracks are exactly the same. They vary. So your speed is going to vary. So if you have a racetrack that has a very long stretch, then you want to get to a maximum speed. So if your gear ratio is wrong, maybe the gear ratio is too big, then you're not going to reach your top speed. You may have a lot of power, you may have a lot of acceleration, but you're going to lose out on that straight edge there. So you have to select the right gears. If you have a racetrack with a lot of curves, so there's a lot of shifting going on, not really high speeds, then you want to have a selection of gears that allows you to develop as much power as you can, and not too much shifting, but enough shifting. So that all depends from track to track, and this is something you need to test out, you need to experience, you need to try it on a track, and this is why these gearboxes, the dog boxes, from Hewland, for instance, like the MK9, I think this one is, has replaceable gears. You can change gear sets for different ratios, and I'm going to show you that in a few minutes. So what you need to take on this is that a dog box is a very rigid box. It is not having synchro meshes. It has mainly two shafts, a fixed one with gears on and a second one with loose gears on that are engaged through the dog ring. This is what happens through the selectors. And you can actually shift around 5,000 RPMs without using the clutch once the car is moving. That is the trick of a good driver, shift even without the clutch. And if you can do that right, that's good. The gearbox can take a lot of beating. That is not an issue. But still, I think this is very interesting. And you can tune the gearbox in terms of ratios towards the proper track. Now, what is a gear ratio? Well, if you have two tooth wheels, a small one and a big one, then if the small one drives the big one, guess what will happen? The big one will turn slower, right? So if this is 10 teeth, this one has 100 teeth, so this one will turn 10 times slower, but it has 10 times more the power than the original one. If it's just the other way around, 100 teeth that drives a small one with 10 teeth, then the speed on the small one will be 10 times the speed of the big one, but the power will be reduced by 10. So this is a bit of how gears and gear ratios are working. I will do another video on this box, actually changing the gears, but not right now. Now we're just talking about this race car, on how they used to build race cars in the 70s. So let me now show you the famous dog ring and also the different gears. I have a whole set of boxes here, and those are not cigars. They are boxes where I keep the gears in. So we have gears for the second gear, third gear, and the fourth gear. And below that you see the ratios. So a 20-32, a 22-30, and then we have a 24-27. Those are different ratios for different gears, and depending on what you put, you will have a better effect on a specific track. So if you're looking, for instance, the fourth gear, this is a 25-26, and this is a 24-27. And then again, we have those different ratios for different tracks. Now, you can see the tracks on there: Francorchamps, Zandvoort, La Croix. So, if you drive on these tracks, then you test out your gears, and then you kind of select them. So before you go to the race, you put the right gears on for that specific track, and you keep them together in boxes. So this is an easy way to remember it. So let me show you that, and then you will understand what that is. So I took out the fourth gear, and this is a ratio of 25 teeth towards 26 teeth. This one right here, the 25 teeth, the one with the grooves, is the one which is fixed to the shaft, which is coming from your clutch or from your engine as such. And it ties in to the other gear, which is connected to the other shaft, which is actually going to your differential. Now, this gear here is always spinning with the shaft it's on because of those teeth. This shaft is freely spinning if it's not selected. However, if you do select it, then we have the dog coming in, and the dog is going to engage it. So let me try to turn this around so we can actually see what the dog is going to do. So here's our dog. And the dog is going to be pushed in to that tooth wheel right there, and it's going to engage with these teeth, like so. And it's going to drag it along, and now we are spinning that second shaft, and it's driving the differential. So that's what the dog does. It comes in, and it goes out. Nothing more than that. Let me lay it flat so you can better see it. So we know that this gear is rotating because it's been driven by the shaft coming from the engine. This one is spinning around with it because that one drives that one. But now this force needs to be moved to the axle, which is going to the differential. And there the dog comes into play. And here is our dog. The dog will be pushed in like so. And now we'll have this one spinning around. And because the dog is there, the dog is grabbing now into the other shaft, and now we have movement on the car. So this is how that works, but it will become more clear once I take all the gears out of this car, and then we will put new gears in. If you look closely to those gears, you can see that they have a number in it, 23, 28, 23, 28. So the big one has 28 teeth, and you're more than welcome to count them. And the second one has 23 teeth. So the ratio is 23, 28. You might have heard people talking about sequential gearboxes and non-sequential gearboxes. This car does not have a sequential gearbox. It is an H pattern, so 1, 2, and then 3 and 4. But as you can see, this is not gentle, right? You're going to be a bit rough with this and quick, because this is the speed. You change gears while you're driving. I forgot to mention one thing on these gears. You can see that the teeth are straight, and that makes it very strong, but it makes it also noisy. So you will hear these gearboxes for sure. Other gearboxes have gears that are having kind of slanted or angled teeth like this, and they are less noisy, but they are not as strong because they tend to push things out of each other. Here the force is not lost because it's a one-on-one. The two teeth from the other one, they're grabbing onto each other, and you don't lose any force. But if they are on an angle, then they tend to push away a bit the gears, and then you lose a bit of power. The rod that you see right there is the one which is actually coming from the front gear selector. And you can turn it left or right to go between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 gears. And then, of course, it's in and out. And you move it. Now, this works very smooth if you drive. Well, smooth is probably the wrong word, because you're really shifting real quick and a little bit violent. But that's the way these boxes are made for. That's how they work. So folks, we have come to the end of this video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. We looked at a 1976 race car, which is almost 50 years old, well, a little bit less, in a pretty good shape and a pretty good condition. So there's a bit of work to be done on it, because I want to have it perfect to get it back on the track. And then with a little bit of luck, you will see me driving the DL19 on the track maybe later this summer, together with our Koenig race car, because we've got 2 race cars that we want to get on the track, but only if they're in tip-top condition. So if you have any comments or any recommendations, feel free, because I just know a few things, not everything, and I can always learn from you. Thank you, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye.